Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Global Azure Norway. My name is Henrik, and I am part of the Norwegian .NET user group who are organizing this event, and I'll be your host for this session. If you have any questions during the talk, please use the chat to post questions, and I'll include them in the Q&A session after the talk. With us here now is our first speaker for tonight, Alexander Slotte. Thanks for joining us, Alexander. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here and joining me for this talk today. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm going to start off this conference, which is a great honor, and talking about a year-long migration here from .NET Framework to .NET Core for a large enterprise application that I was working with a whole team around, which is great. So a bit about myself first. I am Swedish, but I'm living in the United States as of 5 years ago, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. A lot of my free time is spent on machine learning, especially in .NET, and there's actually a conference coming up in just a month's time that focuses on ML.NET, which is the open source library around machine learning in .NET. So if you're curious about learning more about that later, definitely join our Slack channel or sign up for the conference, and we'd love to have you there. But today, we're talking more about .NET Framework to .NET Core. And I want to take you on a journey throughout this year-long period on where we started, what we did, and where we landed. Because a lot of the time right now, going to .NET Core is not so trivial as one may think. There's a lot of complexities when you start thinking about a large enterprise application that there's not so much documentation on, really. There's a lot of documentation on simpler transformations and simpler stuff, but when you start thinking about things with multiple external dependencies and services and old code and so forth, it gets very tricky really quickly. So I hope that this is going to be beneficial for you, and if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to add them at the end. But we'll start off by talking a bit about the application we're migrating and the organization we're working with. And then we'll focus more about the actual kind of work we did to get there and what kind of strategy and tactics and steps worked for us. And then we'll kind of wrap it up and think about what were our lessons learned and what we could have done differently if we had done it today. So to start off, let's look at the application. So the app is a very standard .NET Framework app. It's a large monolith with 20 projects of varying sizes. It has a lot of old dependencies, so a lot of NuGet packages that haven't been updated for years and years and years. We'll see that later in this talk as well. And the front end is an AngularJS and Knockout.js front end, so it's not necessarily web forms or anything like that, but it's just a plain old JavaScript framework on top. But this application is a very large and important application for this organization, and it's connected with multiple dependencies. So they have a lot of external applications that are calling this app, either through message services like RabbitMQ, or through Node.js Glue applications, or directly through the API, or through something like BizTalk. So it is highly, highly connected in this interweaved web of applications. So any change to it is kind of detrimental to some extent to anything else. So we had to be really, really careful here not to break anything. But the app itself is fairly plain .NET Framework, complicated application, but just a lot of old stuff there. If you look at the organization that I was working with here, it's something I call waterfall agile. They were working in smaller Scrum teams with 2-week sprints, but the organization itself was still very waterfall-y. He had, multi-year products, for example, revamping a whole data architecture layer for something that we planned out multiple years in advance, adding a completely new revenue stream to the project, and that's planned out for 2-3 years ahead of time, and there was no way you could change those project plans. So we had to really kind of work our way around those kind of waterfall-style things as part of this migration. And we had to also be very careful not breaking anything, because if we broke anything, the client would be very sad, because this was a financial application where numbers were really important, and we didn't want to, in this case, pay out the wrong amount of money to certain individuals. Another struggle I would say with this organization was that they didn't have a culture of staying up with the latest. So a lot of times, going up to the next version of a NuGet package or trying out a tool or anything like that was very difficult. They weren't necessarily wanting us to do that so much as focusing on just creating new features and not realizing that technical depth builds up over time, and then suddenly that can tip the ship. But the team was fantastic, and one of the really good things with this team was that they focused a lot on mature quality practices. So a lot of automated testing was in place, a lot of work was put in place to kind of get that value across the whole team, and that really saved us, and I'll show more about that in a bit. So how do we get buy-in to do something like this, something as large as a 1-year migration from an old framework to a new? Well, we had multiple failed attempts over the years to try to get this up and running. So to give some context, this organization hosts everything on-prem in IaaS. And one of their goals for the new CIO is to move to the cloud, to AWS, to Kubernetes in containers. And as you may know, it's very difficult to run .NET Framework in a container. You can do it, of course, but it's expensive because they're large images and it's bulky and it's not as nice. So you really need to go to .NET Core to be able to run in Linux containers, just do it much smaller, much faster. So for us, that was really the tipping point when they really went for the Kubernetes container path. This was something they had to do. But we also focused a lot of our efforts on talking about security and talking about how outdated dependencies can really halter your security practices. No client or no company wants to be in the news because they leaked all their important data and all the important information. And having a discussion around security and how about staying up to the latest really helps you with that. Just as you do patching on your servers, you also need to make sure you patch your software, so to speak. But another thing as well to talk about with your teams when you want to do something like this is about the expected, extended life expectancy of an application. If you do something like this, you can probably at least expect 5 more years of application, because suddenly you're up and running something that has smaller footprint in terms of memory and CPU, as well as just getting more up to date on the latest packages. So that was basically kind of the context about the application and the organization. But let's focus a bit on our strategy here. So we started off doing this about a year ago in February 2020, just before the pandemic kind of hit. And we had really no experience with .NET Core. We were all enterprise .NET Framework application developers, and we had no idea where to start. But we set up a couple of kind of cornerstones here that we wanted to follow. And the most important one that I think was really helpful for us was that we did not want to plan and analyze everything up front. We wanted to stay agile and incremental. So we wanted to avoid getting paralyzed by analysis. And we also want to make sure we didn't have a long-running branch. We don't want to kind of start branching off applications saying, this is our old application, this is our new application. We did not want to do that. And the reason for that is because the business really needed to have features being delivered continuously. We couldn't stop doing what we were doing, having a feature freeze. We still needed to provide new functionality to the business. One way of doing this is that we actually dedicated 1 to 2 developers in our team focused on leading this effort and doing that kind of spearheading and analysis, and then spending about 20% of our sprint time and sprint allocation on this migration with the larger team as well involved. And I think that was a great tactic, and I would kind of encourage people to think about that if that's something that works for you. Before we jump into kind of how we did this and what challenges we faced, I would like to say that some of the key success factors for us was that we had a very mature quality culture across the team. We use something called behavior-driven development for our testing, and we wrote a lot of our tests in Gherkin syntax, so functional tests from the API and the UI level. And I really recommend you to think about ramping up your automated testing if you haven't already, and especially on terms of your functional test and UI test. We will see later that unit tests are great for a lot of things, but not for this scenario, because unit test doesn't really check the framework kind of application functionality that we will need here. I also want to kind of really push for my last point here, which is have a fearless approach on technical depth here, or cleaning up stuff. when you start going down this rabbit hole of migrating a large app to .NET Core, you'll find a lot of stuff in your project files and your solution files. And they're going to be dirty. They're going to have things you have no idea what's about. They're going to have things that doesn't make any sense. You may, well, is this actually used anymore? And a lot of times they're not. A lot of times it's going to cost you a lot more to move that to .NET Core than you have to remove it. So I would just have the approach of like, remove it first and ask for forgiveness later. And if you have a solid testing framework, then you will be able to kind of lean on that to find things that you expect to work a certain way. So definitely try to clean up as much as you can. All right, so moving on here to our journey. What did we do to get to the final product here, which actually went to production, I think 2 months ago now, after years of work? Well, the first thing we did was, like any good developer, we Googled things. So we started with Microsoft Docs because that's a good starting point. And I think, the docs in Microsoft are really, really great overall. And there's 2 documentation sites here for how you port something over from framework to .NET Core. And they're both equally good. One is focused more on the web stuff, and one is focused more generally. I would say, like, yep, go ahead and read these. There's a great starting point for everything. But there are, there's a reason why there's 7 minutes to read and not like a month, right? It's because it's very general. It's not going to cover your specific scenarios that you're running into or your specific application. But it's going to give you at least a starting point to understand what the big building blocks to move your application are. The documentation also suggests that you download and use the .NET Portability Analyzer, which basically is a right-click in your solution, and Visual Studio will generate an Excel list of thousands of things that are incompatible for you, so you can work them away. We did that, and I have other kind of peers in the industry that have done as well, but it is not very helpful because it's overwhelming the amount of things you need to fix, and it's not very structured. So you don't really know what is caused by or how you can alleviate that. You just end up with a long list of things that you just, I don't know what to do about this, and you get overwhelmed. So I would just avoid that for now, and I would focus more on the big stuff, and we'll walk through some of them here in this presentation today to see how you can get that resolved anyhow. So this diagram here kind of outlines the steps we had to take to get to our place. For example, we had a lot of different things that we have to do here. And the red things is things that I want to talk about first. So we have no Wcf services, and we had no web forms application. It is something that is just important to think about, because a lot of times when you migrate applications over to .NET Core, you actually have those kind of applications or services, and they are much more complicated to migrate than anything else. We consumed Wcf services, which is very different than actually hosting them, a lot easier. But if you do have any of these constraints in your application, which is very likely, there are ways to resolve them. And I'm going to point you to the documentation for Wcf services, and maybe thinking about going over to gRPC if you can. And I would also think for web forms, I would look at Jeff Fritz, who is a fantastic product manager at Microsoft, and he's done a lot of work on Blazor components, basically being able to kind of port web forms straight to Blazor. So if you have those constraints, have a look at those resources. Also happy to chat more about them separately in questions or later, because I do have a lot of industry peers that have faced these challenges, and they have some great insight in those as well. But we'll focus on a green diagram here today and kind of guide you through that. So let's start off with the first one here, which is upgrading and targeting our application to .NET 4.7.2 and see what that really means. So the first thing I always recommend teams doing is going up from 4.6.2 or 4.5.2 or wherever you're at to 4.7.2. I do not recommend you going to 4.8 actually, but 4.7.2 is fine. And the reason why you want to go to 4.7.2 is because 4.7.2 and .NET Core 3.1 have a very similar kind of API target area, and they both share that through .NET Standard 2.0. And that basically means that there's a lot of things in .NET 4.7.2 and .NET 3.1 that are shared in .NET Standard, but then you'll have certain things in .NET 4.7.2 that does not exist in .NET Standard, and vice versa with .NET Core. But it's a great way to get as close to .NET Core as possible, because if you do that, you can basically start targeting .NET Standard 2.0, which is what we want. The reason why you don't need to go to 4.8 is because 4.8 doesn't get you closer to 3.1, and actually just causes more issues. So don't go to 4.8 if you don't have to. So once you're at .NET 4.7.2, which can take a while to get to because you will get some assembly reference issues and redirect issues. After that, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and migrate your project files or your package.config file to package references. So if you remember how things are right now, you will have a long list of dependencies in your package.config file for your NuGet files. But that's in .NET Core 3.1 and 5 and forward. That's going to be a package reference in your CS project file instead. And there's actually really easy to do this. You just right-click on your project, and you automatically be able to migrate that to package references. And the final thing you want to do as well on this stage here is that you want to convert all your products to SDK project style, which is just easier, much cleaner. And the good thing with this SDK project style is that it's tied to Visual Studio 2019 and not to .NET Framework or .NET Core. So you can do that really anytime you want to. But it gives you a much cleaner project file. You can double click on it and you can open it and view it. And it also doesn't include like defining all the classes that you have in your project. It just by magic, it will just use any class in your directory of your project, and it will have that as part of your compilation. So for example, we have this old package.config. We will kind of remove this. We won't have this target framework 4.7.2 and all this kind of stuff. Instead, we'll go to this SDK project style version instead, where you have this item group with package references in the middle. And you also have an item group for product references. And you have a very neat and clean description of what we're targeting and so forth here. But what you're missing here, right, is you don't see like include class 1, class 2, class 3, because that's not needed anymore. So that's really nice. So once you're on target 4.7.2 here, which could take a while, depending on how many projects you have and kind of what challenges you run into here, you want to start looking at the configuration instead. So what do I mean with this? Well, currently you may be using the web config for your configuration values, right? And this is an XML-based config, and you have transforms for different kind of scenarios, test and stage, and they're just like that. In .NET Core, you have a JSON-based configuration instead. We have app settings for JSON, and then you can have transformations as well if you like, for like .test or .stage or whatever you want to. So you need to start kind of moving over from A to B here. And you can do this before you start targeting .NET Core as well in your projects, just so you know. And this is kind of the beauty of it. And what we need to do here is actually start slowly migrating our providers over to this new format. I'll walk you through the steps, but I just want to highlight that I've written a blog post about this. So it's kind of in depth and it's kind of complicated sometimes on how you want to kind of migrate the configuration over. So if you want to read more about this and have more in detail, you can find it on my blog. It's just alexanderslotte.com, and I think it's one of the first ones still. So definitely have a look at that if you want more detail. Hopefully it's going to be helpful for you. But basically, what you want to do here is you want to get to a state where you can have a web config and app settings JSON side by side for your application for a little bit. So basically, you need to be able to read both at the same time while you slowly migrate over your app setting values to app settings.json. If you have 10 values, you don't need to do that because you can just go straight over, it's all done. But most enterprise apps have a lot of configurations for good and bad. And it will take a bit of time to move them over slowly, as well as in tandem, upgrade your CI/CD tools for overriding those values, for example. And the way you do that is you create a custom provider. Basically, it's a custom provider. It's a small little class that just reads both the web config as well as app settings JSONs together. And once you've done that, you basically can use that provider to create an iConfiguration. And an iConfiguration is an interface that you get from the Microsoft.extensions.configuration NuGet package, which is the new way you do configurations in .NET Core. And what you want to do is you want to replace the old system.configuration manager with this iConfiguration anywhere you use it. And you want to inject it into your classes instead of having the static reference. But once you have ripped out the configuration manager away from your app and you've hooked up the provider, you can then start putting things into your app.settings file from your web config. And this kind of custom provider can look something like this, right? Super simple. You basically inherit from a configuration provider, and you loop over all the config settings in your web config, both the keys as well as the connection strings, and you kind of just add them to this iConfiguration source. And once you do that, you can then create and build a configuration with something like this, where you just add this legacy provider into your build. And of course, here you can tag on your app.settings.json here as well, which you do normally in your core apps, and then you register that iConfiguration into your DI framework, and then you can inject it into whatever you want to do. So depending on how long it will, depending on how many configuration values you have and how much time it takes for you to also port them in your CI/CD tools, this can take a month or 2 months to do. It took me probably 2 months to get this done, because when you change your web config files over to app.settings.json, you also want to organize them differently. So you want them most likely in sections. So you have a nice JSON section, and in the section you have keys related to the specific section. And that causes your config names to change, because suddenly you have section name : and then the name of the key. So you have to go into your CI/CD tools to change that as well accordingly, if you want to do that. But you can do it much faster if you like. There are tools there. Andrew Locke has a fantastic tool that he wrote for kind of automatically migrating web config to app.settings.json. So just kind of look what's out there, and you will be able to use things that works for you. All right, so moving on here. The next thing we want to do here is the dependency updates. And this is a big chunk. Basically what we're doing here, right, is we're going over to all our NuGet packages and saying, you're old, you're really old. You need to get up to speed to something close to the latest so you can run on .NET Standard 2.0. So exactly what I just said here, right? We want to go over all our packages, and we want to make sure they target .NET Standard 2.0. So if I take something like, Automapper, right? Very common, fantastic library. We were down on Automapper 3.1, I think, or 3.0 as our version, which is, far away from 10.1.1, which I think one of the latest ones right now. So that version had no support for .NET Standard 2.0 or .NET Core. It was only .NET Framework. And the way you see that is just you look at the NuGet dependency in either NuGet.org or in Visual Studio, and you can see kind of what the dependencies are for your specific use case here. You want to make sure that your dependency targets .NET Standard 2.0 or below. In this case here, you see Automapper 10.1.1. It targets .NET Standard 2.0, and that's great. That's what we want to do. So you want to either take all NuGet packages to the latest version, or the version that is at least targets 2.0 or below, whatever works for you. Because of course, the further up you go in dependency updates, the more kind of incompatibilities you get, so the more headache you get. So it's a trade-off, right? So to do that and get that to work properly, we had, we were in a situation where we could not stop development. We had to continue delivering features, and we also did not want to have duplicate branches or long-running branches. So what we wanted to do, right, was that we wanted to go ahead and update every product dependency underneath the API layer to the latest and to run .NET Core 3.1 before we started doing the web app. So we basically want to migrate our products in place. If we were to go ahead and switched over directly to .NET Standard 2.0, a lot of things would have broken directly until we updated those packages. So what we did, and I really recommend this approach, is that what you can do is you can actually do multi-framework targeting. So you can target both .NET Core 3.1 and you can target .NET 4.7.2. And then what you do is you just build .NET 4.7.2 for your production and for your CI/CD pipelines until you get .NET Core 3.1 functioning and working. If if you have a small amount of packages and you can update them real quick, you can of course target .NET Standard 2.0 directly. But there actually is there's reasons why you can't really do that for most use cases, and the reason for that is Entity Framework. So this is kind of an important note to make here as well, is that you do not need to update Entity Framework to EF Core when you do this migration. You can actually run EF64 on an application running in .NET Core. And the reason for that is because EF64, specifically 64, is compiled against both. It's compiled against both .NET Framework 472 and .NET Core 3.1. It's not compiled for .NET Standard 2.0, but both separately. So basically, you can also include a reference to Entity Framework 6.4, and you're good to go. But that means that you can't target .NET Standard 2.0 for EF. So if you have EF in your application, you can't target .NET Standard 2.0 for any of those project dependencies. Little complicated explanation, but basically multi-framework targeting is going to be your key in many cases here. So I encourage you all to do it if you can. And when you do multi-framework targeting, you get a whole flora of tooling and things unlocked for you that you can really help you massage your way out of a kind of in-place dependency. So you can use things like conditional dependencies to really get you started. For example, we had tons of packages that we had yet to migrate to the latest version. And what we did is say, okay, well, if you compile to 4.7.2, all good. Go ahead and compile it. We know it's going to work. We're going to use it for production. But if you're running and building for .NET Core 3.1, don't include these packages. So we can basically use a conditional dependency saying here that only include a package if you have a certain framework in mind for your compilation. And of course, people will say directly, well, if you don't include a package, you're going to get compilation issues in your code because suddenly you don't have namespace available, and et cetera, et cetera. Yep, you're right. And that's where pre-processed directives comes in. These are, some ugly things, I think, personally. Before doing this migration, I was like, oh, let's stay away from this old, ugly stuff as far as possible. But they are fantastic in a migration scenario like this, because you can basically switch off a whole package or part of your code, depending on which framework you're compiling against. So, for example, we have SignalR in our application, and SignalR, prior to .NET Core, is its own NuGet package. And in .NET Core 3.1 and forward, it's actually part of the .NET Core SDK. And this causes some issues, right? Because we don't have a one-to-one package swap. We actually have to wait until we have completely migrated over to start using it. So what we could do was just toggle off the Signal Core package and toggle off all the hubs and code in the back. And then in parallel, start building out this parallel new .NET Core SignalR kind of pipeline with dashboards and everything else, which worked really fine. And pre-processed directives really, really helped us to get to that place. So definitely take a look at this, because it's going to help you a lot. I don't think we could have done what we did as smoothly as we did without doing this, without using these. And I would just say that once you are on the core, make sure that you remove this very quickly, because they are going to kind of clutter your code and make it ugly very quickly. So use them with care. So there's a couple of gut juice, when we talk about updating our dependencies, that I really want to bring your attention to. First of all, there's a lot of packages out there that reach end of life, and they have not been ported to .NET Core. We live in an open source world. We love open source. There's tons of good things with it, and I hope we all contribute to open source if we can. But sometimes maintainers, their life, moves on, and things change, and things may not be ported. So, for example, we had two packages that just did not get ported. And one of them was, I think, AutoMock, very popular kind of mocking framework. There was no version for that in .NET Core. So we had to swap off, for our 20,000 unit tests, we had to swap mocking frameworks. That hurt, right? That's a lot of work for 20,000 tests. But AutoFixture is great, and we were able to kind of get that working instead. We also had like a Razor engine, I think. Razor engine, I think it was called, for like email templates that we used. And that also is at end of life, so we have to use Razor Lite instead. And I'm sure you'll run into similar scenarios where something you're using today will not be there in the future. So if you already are thinking about doing this, have a look a bit of what packages are supported in .NET Standard 2.0, and if that's something that is going to be feasible for you or not, or if they migrate over. The second thing I want to talk about is behavioral changes. So they are, obviously when you update a package, there will be breaking API changes. That's just the nature of things, right? And those are okay because you know them, you can lean them against the compiler, and they will find them. But a lot of things that when you go from like Automapper 3.0 to 10.0, there's a lot of behavioral changes too. Like the versions are so far apart that the way that the package actually works has changed. So you may get very unintended consequences of things changing. And we got that with Automapper. Automapper started behaving very differently from 3.0 to 10.0. And the way we kind of caught that was our functional automated test. And they found that really quickly in our pipelines. But just be careful with this because it may come back and bite you. So just be aware that that can change. And the last one is my favorite, which is assembly redirects. When you start going to .NET Framework 4.7.2 here and updating your packages, you will have a lot of assembly redirects. So basically, one package will have a dependency on another package with a different version than what you're already referencing, and suddenly you have a mismatch of dependencies, and they can only load one version into memory and so forth, and it just gets messy. You will have to fight this, and it's tough, but it's okay. You can definitely get over it, and the way of doing that, of course, is adding redirects into your web config. And you can also try, of course, automatic redirects. We tried it. It did not work for us, but I know it worked for some people. But just wake up every day like smiling and thinking, hey, it's going to be a good day. I'm going to win this war, because eventually you will. It's just not going to feel like that every day when you're fighting it, because it can be really, really tough to fight the redirects, because it's not very obvious sometimes what caused them or what's happening there. So, but once you get over this hurdle, you're very close to getting done here, right? You've done your upgrade of targeting for 4.7.2. You got your configuration schema done. You got your updates to your dependencies. So basically, you're in a state right now where all of your lower level projects, like your database project, your domain project, all those things are running on, or at least compiling normally against .NET Core 3.1 and .NET 4.7.2. But now you have your web app left. You have your web API or something like that, right? That you have yet to convert. And this is really tough. This is where it gets complicated, because you can change projects in place for anything that's not a web app or a web API, and you cannot do that for web API. So when you get to web app, you actually have to create a new project completely, and you need to port things over from your old project to your new project. And basically, the steps to do that is you have to migrate everything in your global ASAX to the star.cs class. That defines, everything that has to do with your DI framework and so forth. And you also need to start migrating over controllers and namespaces. So namespaces has changed. Basically, system.web does not exist anymore. So you have to rip that out. And that means also a lot of like attributes and base classes and so forth has changed for you. Return messages and tons of fun stuff. So that's going to be quite a bit of work doing that as well. But I still really encourage you to avoid the long-running branch at all costs, because it's not going to be needed. What I would just do is create a separate web app here, and then start thinking about strategies to port things over. And there's a couple of ways to port things over here to do that. One way, of course, is saying, hey, I give up. This is tough. Just give me a beer. I'll sit back and enjoy my life, but I'm not going to do this. And sometimes it's okay. Some apps here, they can reach end of life instead, and you may not want to actually migrate them over to .NET Core. Like we have a small application and a client that is very, very old. It's in web forms. It's very, very complicated to get the web app over and running. And it's just basically easier to rewrite that app in Blazor, .NET Core from the start. And that's okay. That could be one strategy. Another one, of course, is saying, okay, we're going to do this now, but we're going to do a big bang. We won't actually release anything to production until everything is ported over. We'll stop our feature work. We'll just do this. Depending on your team and your client, yep, feasible. But most times you can't stop all work, at least teams I've been to. We have to continue kind of delivering still for the business. Another approach, of course, is doing side-by-side with redirects. So you may have two web apps in different IS instances or Kestrel, and you may have redirects between pages. And slowly you can migrate over one page or part of your app to the new part. Also fully functional. The one that we did that I really, really want to recommend, at least for us, is something I call incrementally without redirects with a small bang. Very bad name, I know. And if anyone comes up with a better name, please send it my way, because I would love to improve this name. But it worked really, really well for us. And I will kind of talk more about that now, of that strategy and why I think that was such a good way of doing it. So to start thinking about that, let's think about what kind of code we have in the web app, right? What do we have in the web API? I think we have two different types of code there. We have something I call slow changing code, which is basically all the infrastructure and piping. So everything you have in global ASICs today, for example, like your DI framework, setting up AutoMapper, setting up entity framework, setting up whatever you kind of have there, logging and tracing and all those kind of stuff. That is infrastructure, and you rarely change that, right? You put it up, you set it up one time, and maybe occasionally you start adding a new library or thing, but basically it's pretty static. It doesn't change a lot. It's rare that it goes in and does anything there. And then you have everything else, like the fast changing code, things that change by new features and sprints. So controllers, view models, and services that you may have in the API layer still. Those kind of things, right? They can change at a whim depending on what feature you have in a sprint. So you can never guarantee that it's not going to be unchanged. And the reason why you want to separate these two things out is because if you start porting over things into a new project, if you start porting things over that change a lot to your product, that means you have to make sure you also keep that up to date. So any change in the old product for production code right now needs to also be ported over to the new product. And that can be very difficult to keep kind of balanced and synced up. So that's why you need to make sure you make a distinction between those two, because each type of code here needs a different approach on how you port it to your new web app. So again, I mentioned that we had slow changing code for Autofac, AutoMapper, like all the piping. And the way we did and handled this part of the code here is actually we had sprint features tickets in our sprints. So we basically said, okay, now we're going to go ahead and wire wrap Autofac for .NET Core. So we're going to create a ticket for it. We will define and flush out the technical analysis and requirements for this. And we are then going to do one of those things per sprint. So some developers will jump on Autofac in .NET Core, and they will wire it up in the new web app, and they will test to make sure that Autofac works in the new web app. And we continue doing that for every kind of single thing here. We can do AutoMapper and authentication and all those kind of things bit by bit, ticket by ticket, and without doing anything that's breaking. And this is a great way of doing it, because you get the team really involved in some of these things that they may never get exposed to otherwise. And you do it risk-free, because you're doing it to a new web app that doesn't go to production, but you do it in the same code base in master. And once you kind of have this solid platform that you can stand on, so you can at least open your application on like one page, whatever that is, then you at least you have your platform there. You can authenticate yourself, you can wire up your DI framework, you can do kind of those stuff, very basic stuff, but the platform that you kind of rest on. If you then move over to the fast changing code, right, the controllers and the view models and so forth, that is very different and needs to be treated differently. And the way we did this, we actually used a custom tool for this. So we created a custom console application to handle these scenarios. And I'm going to walk you through our thought process here, because it's a little bit complicated, but I hope you will kind of appreciate it once we get to the end here. But basically here to the left here, we had our master branch in .NET Framework, right? And what we did is we created a console app, very small console app, that could run against our branch, and using regex and other things, convert our web app to .NET Core. Basically saying it will take everything from an old product and it will move it over to a new product, and it would while doing it, it would convert things that are common. Because when you start looking at the fast changing code, the common things that you should do are things like namespaces, inherit from other base classes, change attributes, maybe do some other redirect somewhere, but they're pretty you can standardize them quite a bit. So for example, we did global namespace adjustments. We moved over files physically. We renamed projects. We removed the old projects. We started targeting .NET Core for every product that we had instead of having multi-framework targeting and so forth. And it's perfect because you can run this tool for 5 minutes and suddenly you have a fully functional web app in .NET Core, and then you can start experimenting on that. You can start, okay, let's do it manually. Let's open it up. Does it work? Does it break? We can start like throwing all of our automated tests on it, our UI test and API test, and saying, does it actually respond? Does it work? And a lot of times you'll find that no, it does not work. Things are breaking. Oh, we didn't expect this, or we didn't see this one coming. And that's great. The whole idea here is you do it incrementally. So you discard that branch, and then you take the learning from your experience here and say, okay, is this something that is very specific to .NET Core that I can't do for applications as a whole? If so, add it to the tool. Say, okay, I'll update the tool to also adjust this little thing for me. If it's something that is more global that you can actually do to the master branch directly, because it applies to both the .NET Framework version as well as .NET Core, or you can just do it straight into the project, then open a ticket, create a ticket, and prioritize that in future sprint and adjust your work based on that. And then you continue doing this kind of experiment. You run the tool and you try and see how it works, and you can slowly learn what you need to fix in your web app until you get to a place where everything works. And the cool thing with this is that you get so much confidence in your application without committing to anything. You don't have to commit any code to master branch. You don't have to deploy anything to production. You just have to kind of experiment, but you do it in one branch. And I call it deferred branch approach, really. But once you get to this place here, you actually get to a place where everything works. Suddenly you have web app in .NET Core. All of your lower level things are converted as well using the tool. And all of your automated tests are working. And suddenly you can take this branch here and using a PR build, you can deploy it to non-prod environments of your choosing and have users or QA manually test it as well to making sure it actually fully works. And when you feel like, hey, we're on the right track, this works great, everything seems to be working, then you can commit to actually merging this to master and really committing to this migration and saying, okay, we're good to go. We feel very confident here. We can go to production. So it's a nice way of getting some real security and safety around this as well. And I'm happy to chat more about this approach, offline or during questions, because I know it's a lot of things in this diagram here. But this is if there's something to take away from this talk today, I would say this is one of the most important pieces, because this is very custom for us and it worked really well. So the only thing I would say as well, when you're looking at the web app and migrating things over to .NET Core, there are a couple of things to think about that may not be obvious. So for us, for example, we had a lot of ambiguous endpoints, basically endpoints in the same route. And that's really bad, okay? But it works in .NET Framework because you have an order attribute and it still kind of finds the right way. .NET Core is much more strict. It does not approve of that, which is great. But basically, you have to be aware of that if you have that, because your web app may not start. The second thing I want to say as well is that from our UI in Angular, sometimes we didn't actually provide the full payload to our API. So we may skip a Boolean value because it's false, but so we like, okay, well it's going to be false, so we don't actually provide it in the payload, and the API then sets it to false in the back there. We're all good. .NET Core does not do the same thing. If you don't set the correct, the full payload, it's not going to by default just set the default value. It's going to actually throw an exception. There's ways around this. You can create custom converters to do this for you, but it's also something to think about. And I think this goes into performance overall .NET Core. This kind of clean away some of these edge cases, so the majority doesn't need them anyway. But there are ways around it. It's just that you have to think about them when you develop this. The third thing I want to mention as well is the API controller attribute. So you can decorate all your controllers with the API controller attribute or your base controller, which kind of gives you the ability to bind post payloads to your methods, and does a lot of other fun stuff that you really need. So in general, I think it's a good thing to do it, but just be careful with it because it does some things that you don't want to sometimes. For example, we had custom validations on everything we did. So if something comes down to the API, we want to go over the payload, and then we want to generate a custom message, very custom, and return to UI. If you have the API control attribute, it actually won't do that because it will bounce back and say the payload is invalid before we even get to custom attributes. There's also ways of suppressing that behavior, but again, just be aware that it's the case, so you have to do that specifically. Other things we run into as well, are if you work with BizTalk, for example, we started having issues with BizTalk being able to authenticate to our API. So suddenly a BizTalk couldn't actually pass all the credentials to our API through a Kerberos ticket, and we had issues with that. And the way to solve that is actually enabling impersonation in BizTalk. So if you ever use BizTalk to hit your API and you have issues with authentication, make sure that BizTalk enables impersonation on their front, and you will solve that by itself here. So we have ported the web app. We have done all the hard work. We are almost at the finish line right now. And the final piece I want to touch here, real brief, is just to talk about our CI/CD pipelines. And it's really just one slide, but it's something that I think is very important to mention. So, when you are on .NET Framework, you will be relying heavily on MS Build, right? MS Build is going to be your friend. When you move forward to .NET Core, you don't need MS Build anymore, which is great. We all don't like MS Build, I think. So you can rely on the .NET CLI instead to do your build, test, and publish, and everything in between. And you're going to find that your build scripts and your CI tooling is going to be much more precise and much more condensed because of this, because you need to define a lot less. So it's not a lot of work, but just be aware you need to plan for this as well. You need to plan for updating your pipelines to use .NET CLI. And the way we did this ourselves was that we actually duplicated our pipelines. We used TeamCity. But you can do this, of course, in Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions as well. But basically duplicate your pipelines and let them run in parallel. And then when you feel like your CI/CD tool builds your .NET Core version of your app properly, you can then just start using that one instead of the existing one, and then suddenly you're out of the problem. And the final thing I want to mention as well is that I mentioned before that we did not go to EF Core directly. We went to EF 6.4 instead, and we stayed on that. And I really encourage you to all to do it if you can, because if you have a large footprint of your application, like we had, like 500 entities, changing to EF Core, or EF5, I guess it's called right now, it's very risky. I mean, it's basically porting you to a completely new framework. And you may run into a lot of data issues by doing that. A lot of stuff that are different. And it's all good. You should do it at some point. But you may want to hold off on that migration until you're fully on .NET Framework or .NET Core first. And then start a separate initiative, because it's very risky. But if you stay on .NET Core and EF 6.4, just be aware that running migrations and adding migrations is a little tricky. You can't use the migrate.exe anymore. You have to use ef6.dll. And there's very little documentation on how you actually run and create migrations in this kind of intermediate land here. But fully doable. You have to create basically some PowerShell scripts to do this, because there's a lot of specific coding to do that. But if you have questions on this, or if you want help with this, reach out to me. And I'm happy to provide kind of the ones I have that we used. But I spent quite a bit of time for me, actually, to figure out how to do this myself, because it wasn't very obvious, and Microsoft does not want people to be in this limbo land for too long. So they don't have any documentation at all actually on this. There's just a small thread, I think, on a GitHub open issue that you can look at that gives you a hint on how to do this. But it is doable, fully doable, so please go for it if you can. Final slide here before questions is lessons learned. I would say that functional test is going to be your friend. Add them if you can, because they're going to really help everything. But don't care too much about unit tests, because they won't really tell you if your upgrade is working or not. As I mentioned, pre-processor directives is really, really helpful. Embrace them if you can. If you want to change your products in place, definitely look at them, because they'll be helpful. There's no the need to migrate to EF Core, as I mentioned, and also consider staying on IIS. A lot of folks want to go straight to Kestrel, right? Because Kestrel is cool, and that's why we have .NET Core. But you can actually run .NET Core in IIS as well. And again, I would think about what are the things that you can do to get to .NET Core first before taking on new technology like that. Because that's going to be helpful to limit the scope of your risk and limit the scope of your work, and get more value to your client and your business before anything else. Also, I would say that migrating the web app is the hardest part. That is going to be the most complex part. The rest is tedious and tough, but it's not so complicated as opposed to just have to do it. But the web app is very complicated, but fully doable. And I encourage you all to go down that route, because it's really fun to be on the core. It's fantastic for application. It's, for us, we had like a 30-35% performance increase. It's just something that you want to do, and it really makes sense. So hopefully what I've showed you today has been helpful for you down that route, and giving you some thoughts on how you want to do that as well. And hopefully I have given you some confidence as well that this is actually possible and not just a pipe dream that it's not going to happen. But I'm going to leave the floor open and give it back to Håkan and Henrik now for any questions that you may have. But I just want to thank you for joining this session today. And you can always find me on Twitter, on Alex Slotte on Twitter, or on GitHub if you have any questions or any thoughts after this talk today.
All right. So thank you, Alexander. Quite a knowledgeable and very concrete examples and helpful hints you had. So definitely a talk I will forward to my team. It was really nice for us stuck on the .NET framework side for a bit longer. Not too many questions from the audience, but I have one for myself. If you had to do it all again, what would you do differently?
Good question. I think, what have I done differently? I think I would have involved even more team members in it. We rotated in and out team members, but only specific people, because those were the ones showing interest and want to be part of this transformation. We should have kind of more or less forced some more people kind of involved, because once you are on .NET Core, there's a new way of doing it. There's also other things to think about, and it's also really engaging for the team to be part of this transformation and own the application. So this is a great way of you kind of upskilling your developers, if you will, and making them part of the solution. So doing that, I think, would be something that I would have done differently. I would also, if I would have known this before, I would have spent less time trying to migrate EF Entity Framework to EF Core. We started trying to do that for like a month, and then we just realized, hey, you don't need to do this anymore, and we dumped that. But that was also like a wasted month. So I wish someone had told me before that was not needed, for sure.
Okay, thank you. And we have one from Oddbjörn. So I'll read it out loud as well. Any thoughts about the different Microsoft support policies of .NET Core and full framework?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so as you may notice, Microsoft is going more towards like instead of doing like 10-year support policies, they're doing short support policies. Because they're in their thought and their mind, software and applications needs to move with time, and they can't remain static and forgotten in a closet somewhere, but it needs to actually be maintained and continuously improved. With that said, though, .NET Core 3.1 has long-term support, and I can't remember what the actual number of years is right now, but I think it's like 3-4 years, something like that. But also .NET, I think 6 will have the same. I don't think .NET 5 has that right now, but they will do a yearly release every year, and I think every 2 or 3 years they do a long-term support version that will give support. So I wouldn't expect there to be any kind of issues rather than that. I would actually say that it's easier, because good thing with .NET Core, right, is that it's open source, and it's much more engaging on GitHub. So you have a lot more GitHub issue threads that you can follow down, instead of like older Microsoft support forums that doesn't always make any sense. So for me, at least, I think it's much easier to find solutions for things I struggle with in .NET Core than in .NET Framework.
All right, and thanks for the question. So we don't have any more, so I think I'll take the opportunity to say thank you to Alexander, and we'll take a short break now in the stream. I'll be back with Johan on the hour at 6 p.m. So
thank you very much.
Thanks, Alexander, and see you guys soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.